Your emotions are not your identity. They're your programming, a neuroscientific and philosophical guide. Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power. Viktor Frankl. For everyone who has said, "That's just who I am," about an emotion you secretly wish you didn't have. Preface. The moment everything changes. There is a moment that comes, at different times for different people, when you realize something that seems obvious in hindsight but is genuinely revelatory when you first grasp it, that the way you feel right now is not necessarily the way you are. You might be feeling anxious, but you are not an anxious person. You might be feeling sad, but you are not a sad person. You might be feeling angry, but you are not an angry person. These emotions are happening in you, but they are not you. They are movements, fluctuations, weather patterns passing through the landscape of your consciousness. And understanding this distinction, truly understanding it, not just intellectually but in your bones, changes everything about how you relate to your emotional life. Most people live their entire lives without making this distinction. They experience an emotion and immediately identify with it. They feel anxious and conclude that they are an anxious person, that this is their nature, that this is who they are. They feel angry and believe that anger is part of their identity, something fundamental to their character. They feel inadequate and take this as truth about their essential worth. The emotion becomes the identity, and the identity becomes a prison. But what if it is not true? What if the emotion you are experiencing is not your identity but your programming? What if the way you feel right now is the result of neural circuits that were shaped by your genetics, your early childhood experiences, your trauma, your habits, and your cultural conditioning, and not because this is inherently who you are? This book is about that distinction and what becomes possible when you truly grasp it. It is about understanding your emotional life not as a reflection of your identity or your worth, but as a form of programming, systems and patterns that were installed, layer by layer, through your history. And it is about what you can do with that understanding. How to work with your emotional programming rather than being run by it. How to create different emotional patterns if the current ones are not serving you. And how to live with genuine freedom in relation to the emotions that arise in your experience. This freedom is not about becoming emotionless or suppressing your feelings. Quite the opposite. It is about being able to feel the full range of your emotional experience, the anger, the sadness, the fear, the joy, without being identified with it, without believing that your emotions are truth about who you are, without being controlled by them. The path to this freedom requires understanding how emotions work, what they actually are, how they get programmed into your system, and what it takes to change that programming. It requires both scientific understanding and practical wisdom. And it is the work of this book to provide both. Begin here. Begin with the simple understanding that what you feel is not necessarily who you are. And see where that realization takes you. Introduction. The confusion that runs your life. We are running our lives based on a fundamental confusion. We are confusing our emotional programming with our identity. And this confusion is the source of most of our suffering, our self-imposed limitations, and our sense of being trapped in patterns we cannot escape. Here is what this confusion looks like in practice. You feel anxious in social situations, and you conclude that you are an introvert, a socially anxious person, someone who is fundamentally uncomfortable with others. This becomes your identity. You make decisions based on this identity. You avoid social situations, you select careers that minimize social interaction, you interpret social interactions through the lens of your anxiety. And you experience this identity as fixed, unchangeable, simply who you are. But what if what is actually true is something different? What if you experience anxiety in social situations because of specific neural circuits that were shaped by your childhood experiences, your genetic temperament, your past traumas, your habitual patterns of thinking? What if the anxiety is real and needs to be worked with, but is not who you are? What if you could change your relationship to the anxiety, or even change the intensity and frequency of the anxiety itself, if you worked with it as programming rather than as identity? The distinction is crucial. The emotion is real. The feeling is genuinely happening in your body and your nervous system. But the emotion is not truth about you, and it is not your identity. It is programming. It is a pattern that was installed, layer by layer, through your experience. And like all programming, it can be understood, worked with, and changed. What this book is about. This book has several interconnected purposes. First, it is about helping you understand what emotions actually are, not as mysterious forces or as reflections of truth about yourself, but as physiological and neurological events that are the product of specific causal processes. When you understand the causation, you stop experiencing the emotion as something that is just happening to you and start understanding it as something that is being produced by identifiable systems in your body. Second, it is about understanding how emotions become programmed into your system. This involves your genetic predispositions, your early childhood experiences, your traumas, your repeated habits of thought, your conditioning through your social and cultural environments. Understanding this programming helps you see your emotional patterns not as strange quirks or personality traits that are just who you are, but as the inevitable result of this programming. Third, it is about the profound difference between having an emotion and being identified with that emotion, between feeling angry and being an angry person, between feeling inadequate and being inadequate, between feeling anxious and being an anxious person. This distinction is where real freedom begins. Fourth, it is about what you can actually do with this understanding. How can you work with emotions as programming rather than being run by them? How can you create new patterns if the current ones are not serving you? How can you live with the freedom of understanding that your emotions are not the final truth about who you are or what you are capable of? The central insight. The central insight of this book is simple but profound. Your emotions are not your identity, they are your programming. They are the output of specific neural systems that were shaped by your genetics, your history, your habits, and your circumstances. Understanding this allows you to have a completely different relationship with your emotional life, one of observation and choice rather than identification and compulsion. Chapter 1. What we get wrong about emotions. To understand emotions as programming rather than identity, we must first understand what emotions actually are. And what they are turns out to be quite different from what most people believe. The folk psychology view. The common understanding of emotions treats them as expressions of the inner self, as reflections of who you really are, what you really care about, what is truly important to you. In this view, emotions are truth. If you feel ashamed, you are being shameful. If you feel unworthy, you are unworthy. If you feel angry, there is injustice that needs to be responded to. The emotion is the signal, and you should trust it and act on it. But neuroscience and psychology have spent the last several decades demonstrating that this understanding is fundamentally mistaken. Emotions are not windows into objective reality. They are outputs of neural systems that are shaped by genetics, past experience, current context, and interpretive frameworks, not by the objective truth of the situation. What emotions actually are. Emotions are best understood as complex patterns of neural activation and physiological response that are generated when your nervous system interprets incoming information through the filters of your past experience, your values, your beliefs, and your current state. This is quite different from the folk psychology view. An emotion is not a revelation of truth. It is an output of a system that has been trained to respond to certain stimuli in certain ways based on your history. It is more similar to how a computer program generates output based on its programming than to a direct perception of reality. Two people witness the same situation, perhaps a boss giving critical feedback. The first person feels defensive, angry, and hurt. The second person feels curious and motivated to improve. Neither person is perceiving reality more accurately than the other. Both are experiencing different emotional responses based on their different histories, their different interpretive frameworks, their different nervous system conditioning. The three components of emotion. Modern emotion science has clarified that emotions actually consist of three integrated components: a cognitive, evaluative component, a physiological component, and an action tendency component. All three components are real. When you feel anxious before a presentation, there are genuine changes in your heart rate, your breathing, your blood pressure. There is genuine activation of your threat detection system. But the threat being detected is not a threat from the presentation itself. It is a threat interpreted through your history, your beliefs, your past experiences. The important thing to understand is that all three components are the product of neural programming. Your cognitive interpretation is shaped by past experience. Your physiological response is shaped by your nervous system's learned associations. Your action tendency is shaped by patterns of behavior that you have practiced repeatedly. The emotion identity confusion. The confusion that costs most people their freedom is the confusion between having an emotion and being identified with that emotion. It seems like a small distinction, but it is actually a vast one. When you experience an emotion and then identify with it, when you say, "I am anxious," or "I am angry," or "I am inadequate," you are making a category mistake. You are taking a temporary physiological and neurological state and treating it as an enduring characteristic of who you are. This confusion creates a feedback loop that intensifies the very emotion you are identifying with. When you identify as an anxious person, you interpret your anxiety as confirmation of your identity. You begin to expect anxiety. You make choices that avoid situations that trigger anxiety. The identity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Breaking this loop requires the clear seeing that an emotion is something that is happening, not something that you are. It is a temporary state being produced by your nervous system based on its programming, not a permanent characteristic of your identity. Chapter 2. How Emotions Are Programmed, the Machinery of Feeling. To understand emotions as programming, we need to understand how emotions get programmed into your system in the first place. The programming happens through several interconnected pathways, each of which deserves examination. The classical conditioning pathway. The most straightforward mechanism through which emotions get programmed is classical conditioning, the pairing of a neutral stimulus with an emotionally significant stimulus repeatedly, until the neutral stimulus alone begins to trigger the emotional response. Classical conditioning is profoundly powerful because it operates largely outside of consciousness. You are not learning that you should be anxious in these situations through any kind of rational process. The pairing of stimulus and response happens automatically, and the conditioning operates automatically. The operant conditioning pathway. A second major pathway through which emotions become programmed is operant conditioning, the process through which behaviors that are followed by rewarding consequences become more likely, and behaviors followed by punishing consequences become less likely. Operant conditioning shapes emotions primarily through the patterns of behavior that it reinforces. If anxiety is followed by avoidance, and avoidance is followed by relief, the brain learns that anxiety followed by avoidance leads to reward. This reinforces both the anxiety and the avoidance. The crucial thing about operant conditioning is that the reinforcement happens automatically and outside of conscious awareness. The nervous system is learning associations between emotions and consequences without you having to decide that you are learning them. The observational learning pathway. A third pathway through which emotions become programmed is through observational learning, learning through watching others, particularly attachment figures and people we identify with. Children learn emotional responses by observing the emotional responses of their parents and caregivers. If a parent responds to a situation with anxiety, the child learns that situation is threatening. The learning happens through observation and modeling completely outside of consciousness. Cultural transmission works through the same mechanism. If you are in a culture that emphasizes shame as a way of regulating behavior, you will learn shame-based emotional responses. The culture programs your emotional responses through the everyday models that you observe and absorb. The cognitive interpretation pathway. A fourth pathway involves the interpretation or meaning you assign to situations and events. If you interpret criticism as evidence that you are inadequate, your nervous system will respond with shame and self-doubt. If you interpret the same criticism as useful feedback for improvement, your nervous system will respond with interest and motivation. These interpretations are shaped by your previous experiences, the narratives you have absorbed, your cultural background, your family stories, your past trauma. Over time, through repeated exposure to situations and the consistent interpretation of those situations through the same lens, emotional responses become programmed. The physiological state pathway. Finally, emotions can be programmed through patterns of physiological state. If your body is frequently in a state of activation, if you have chronic stress, poor sleep, inadequate nutrition, your nervous system learns to respond to the world as though it is chronically under threat. Similarly, if your body is frequently in a state of deactivation, if you have depression or are in a state of chronic demoralization, your nervous system learns apathy, hopelessness, and withdrawal. The emotional programming is not just cognitive or behavioral. It is physiological. Chapter 3. The Neuroscience of Emotional Circuits. Understanding how emotions are programmed requires some understanding of the neurobiology of emotion, the actual brain systems and neural circuits that generate emotional responses. The amygdala and the threat detection system. The most prominent neural structure in emotion science is the amygdala, a small, almond-shaped structure deep in the brain that serves as the primary threat detection system. The amygdala is exquisitely tuned to detect signals of potential danger in the environment. What is crucial to understand about the amygdala is that it does not operate logically or rationally. It is designed for speed. It can generate a fear response in milliseconds, before conscious awareness has even registered what it is responding to. This made perfect evolutionary sense. If there was a threat, you did not have time to consciously deliberate. But here is the problem. The amygdala learns through conditioning. When you experience a negative event, the amygdala learns that situations similar to that one are dangerous. And once the amygdala has learned that something is dangerous, it will respond to situations that resemble that dangerous situation with the same fear response, regardless of whether the current situation is actually dangerous. The prefrontal cortex and emotional regulation. If the amygdala is the accelerator of fear, the prefrontal cortex is the brake. The prefrontal cortex is the region most responsible for rational thought, deliberation, perspective-taking, and emotional regulation. When the prefrontal cortex is functioning well and adequately connected to the amygdala, there is a healthy dialogue. The amygdala detects a potential threat and generates an alert. The prefrontal cortex receives the alert, examines the actual situation, and either confirms the threat or reinterprets the situation as safe. But when the prefrontal cortex is not functioning well, which happens under stress, during trauma, when fatigued, the dialogue breaks down. The amygdala's response dominates, and the prefrontal cortex cannot effectively regulate it. The insula and interoception. Another important region for emotion is the insula, a region deep in the brain that is responsible for interoception, which is the sensing of your body's internal state. The insula takes the signals from your body and converts them into conscious bodily awareness. When the insula is working normally, you have good access to your body's signals. But when the insula is disrupted, which often happens in trauma or chronic stress, you can lose access to your bodily signals. Neuroplasticity and the possibility of change. The crucial final point about all of these neural systems is that they are not fixed. They change in response to experience. This is neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, to form new connections, to change based on what you practice and experience repeatedly. This means that if your amygdala has learned to be afraid of particular situations, it can learn not to be afraid through repeated safe exposures. If your prefrontal cortex has been weakened by trauma, it can be strengthened. The neural circuits of emotion are not destiny. They are programming, and programming, by definition, can be changed. Chapter 4. Your temperament, the hardware you were born with. Before you learned anything through experience, Before you developed any behavioral patterns, before you had any life events that shaped your psychology, you already had a fundamental emotional predisposition. This is temperament, the genetic and biological foundation that influences how you tend to respond emotionally. The temperament dimensions. Researchers have identified several fundamental dimensions of temperament that appear to be partly genetic and partly shaped by very early experience. These dimensions are not personality traits, they are emotional predispositions. One dimension is sensitivity or reactivity. Some people's nervous systems are highly responsive to stimulation, while others are less reactive. A highly sensitive nervous system responds strongly to the same stimulus that a less sensitive nervous system barely registers. A second dimension is approach withdrawal orientation. Some people's nervous systems are biased toward approaching novel stimuli and trying new things, while others are biased toward withdrawing and being cautious. A third dimension is positive affect-negative affect balance. Some people's baseline emotional states tend to be more positive, while others tend to be more negative. A fourth dimension is regulatory capacity. Some people can manage their emotional states relatively easily, while others have more difficulty with emotional regulation. Temperament is not destiny. The crucial thing to understand is that temperament is your starting point, not your destination. Yes, you may be born with a nervous system that is highly sensitive. These are real characteristics of your neurobiology. But none of these temperamental predispositions are destiny. Temperament sets the baseline, but experience shapes what you do with that baseline. A person born with high sensitivity can learn to manage their responses to overstimulation. A person with a withdrawal bias can learn to approach novelty. What is required is an understanding that your temperament is not a problem. It is simply the hardware you were working with. And you can build new software, new patterns of response, new practices, new ways of working with your nervous system, that works with your temperament rather than fighting it. Chapter 5. Childhood Programming, How Early Experience Shapes Emotional Patterns. If temperament is the hardware you were born with, childhood experience is where much of the software gets installed. The first years of life are extraordinarily important for emotional development, attachment and the roots of emotional safety. The psychologist John Bowlby's groundbreaking work on attachment revealed that the quality of the relationship between a child and their primary caregivers is the foundational programming for emotional life. When a caregiver is consistently responsive to a child's needs, when the child cries and the caregiver comes, when the child is afraid and the caregiver provides comfort, the child's nervous system learns that the world is safe and that they can rely on others. This creates what is called secure attachment. When caregiving is inconsistent, cold, punishing, or absent, the child's nervous system learns different lessons. It learns that the world is unpredictable, that needs may not be met, that reaching out may result in rejection or harm. This creates what is called insecure attachment. These patterns are not conscious beliefs. They are automatic patterns of nervous system activation that shape emotional responses throughout life. The person with secure attachment will tend to feel that relationships are reliable. The person with insecure attachment will tend to feel that relationships are fragile. Neither of these patterns is permanent. Neural circuits formed in childhood can be changed, but they are the foundation of emotional programming that requires understanding and intentional work to change. Trauma and wounding. Beyond the baseline of attachment security, specific traumatic or wounding events in childhood create deep emotional programming. When a child experiences abuse, neglect, loss, or humiliation, these events become encoded in their nervous system in particular ways. Traumatized nervous systems are stuck in a kind of frozen time. They are responding as if the original danger is still present. This will be explored further in a later chapter on trauma specifically. But it is important to mention here because childhood trauma is one of the most significant sources of emotional programming. Modeling and the internalization of parental patterns. Beyond attachment and trauma, children also learn emotional patterns through modeling, by observing their parents and caregivers and internalizing their emotional responses. Many people report being shocked to hear themselves using their parents' words or responding in their parents' way, despite having sworn they would never do so. This is the modeling effect in action. The emotional response is not coming from a conscious decision. It is coming from deeply embedded programming, conditional love, and the roots of shame. Another crucial source of childhood programming is the degree to which a child's parents offer unconditional versus conditional love. When parents express love unconditionally, the child internalizes a sense of inherent worthiness. But when parental love is conditional on achievement, appearance, or behavior, a different programming takes hold. The child learns that they are only lovable when they perform well. They internalize shame about their natural self. This conditional love programming creates what the psychologist John Bradshaw called toxic shame, a deep sense that there is something fundamentally wrong with who you are. And toxic shame becomes a central organizing principle for emotional and behavioral patterns throughout life. Chapter 6. The Stories We Tell: How Narrative Shapes Emotional Identity. Beyond the direct programming of childhood experience, there is another crucial layer of emotional programming: the stories you tell yourself about yourself. These narratives shape how you interpret events and what emotional responses you habitually generate. The power of narrative. Humans are narrative creatures. We do not simply experience events. We organize our experiences into stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. And these stories shape how we feel and how we behave. The narrative you tell about yourself is not a neutral description of facts. It is an interpretation of facts, selected and organized in particular ways. Two people can have the same experience and tell completely different stories about what it means. One person might interpret a romantic rejection as evidence of a story: no one will ever love me. There is something fundamentally unlovable about me. This interpretation generates emotions of shame, despair, and hopelessness. Another might interpret it as, this person and I were not the right match. I am lovable, and this just wasn't right. This generates emotions of sadness, but not shame. The origin of the stories. The stories you tell about yourself do not come from nowhere. They are shaped by the explicit messages you received from your parents, the implicit messages conveyed through how you were treated, the cultural stories you absorbed, your interpretation of significant events, the feedback you received from the world. Often, the stories are established early and then become self-perpetuating. If you absorb the story that you are shy, you will interpret ambiguous social interactions through that lens. The story becomes identity. Narrative revision is a tool for change. One of the interesting things about stories is that they are revisable. Unlike facts, which are either true or not, stories are interpretations, and interpretations can change. This is not about denying what happened. It is about different interpretation of what happened. A person might have had the experience of a parent who was critical and cold. They can tell the story that the parent's coldness was because the child was unlovable. Or they can tell the story that the parent was damaged by their own wounds. Or they can tell the story that while the experience was painful, the person now has the power to change those patterns. As you go through this book and begin to work with your emotional programming, you will find yourself naturally revising the stories you tell. As you understand emotions as programming rather than identity, the story, I am an anxious person, becomes, I have a nervous system that was programmed to respond with anxiety in certain situations. That is a different story. And it opens up different possibilities. Chapter 7. Emotional habits and the behavioral loops that sustain them. Once emotions are programmed into your nervous system through the mechanisms we have discussed, they become further entrenched through behavioral loops. The emotions generate behaviors, and the behaviors reinforce the emotions, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. How emotions generate behavior. Emotions are inherently motivating. They generate action tendencies, impulses toward particular behaviors. Anger generates the impulse to attack or assert. Fear generates the impulse to flee or freeze. Shame generates the impulse to hide or disappear. In the modern world, These action tendencies are often not functional. You feel anger in a professional setting and have the impulse to punch someone, not acceptable. You feel fear of social judgment and have the impulse to avoid all social interaction, not workable. The avoidance loop. One of the most important behavioral loops for understanding emotional programming is the avoidance loop. When you feel afraid of something, the natural action tendency is to avoid it. And avoidance is rewarding. When you avoid the feared situation, the anxiety goes down. But avoidance is also reinforcing the fear. Every time you avoid something because you are afraid, you are telling your nervous system that the thing you are avoiding is actually dangerous. The fear does not go down. It gets stronger. Someone afraid of social interaction avoids social situations. The short-term relief of avoiding feels good. But the long-term effect is that the fear grows. This loop is so common that it is the basis of many anxiety disorders. The control loop. Another critical behavioral loop is the attempt to control or suppress the emotion. When you feel an emotion that you do not want, the natural impulse is to try to get rid of it. But attempts to suppress emotions typically fail and often backfire. Someone who experiences anxiety and then judges themselves for being anxious now has anxiety plus anxiety about anxiety. The attempt to control the anxiety has made the overall suffering worse. The rumination loop. A third important behavioral loop is rumination, the repetitive thinking about something emotionally significant. The person engaging in rumination often believes they are solving the problem. But rumination is emotion regulation attempt gone awry. Someone who feels inadequate ruminates about all the ways they are inadequate, which intensifies the feeling of inadequacy. The rumination feels like it is helping, but it is actually amplifying the emotion. Chapter 8. The imposter emotions, when you feel one way while being another. One of the most confusing and destabilizing aspects of emotional programming is when your emotional experience is out of sync with your actual circumstances or capabilities. You feel inadequate when you have genuinely accomplished things. You feel like a fraud when you are legitimately competent. The imposter syndrome phenomenon. Imposter syndrome, the persistent conviction that you are not as capable as others believe, is perhaps the most famous example of imposter emotions. People who are objectively successful, accomplished, and competent feel like frauds. What is happening neurologically is that the person's emotional programming has created a sense of fundamental inadequacy that is disconnected from their actual competence level. The emotions say you are not enough. But the facts say you are qualified. The disconnect creates enormous suffering. The person has to expend energy managing the imposter emotions while simultaneously performing competently in their role. Why emotional programming becomes disconnected from reality. How does this disconnect happen? One way is through the overgeneralization of childhood experiences. A child receives criticism or conditional love and learns they are fundamentally inadequate. But later in life, they accomplish things. But the emotional programming from childhood does not automatically update. Another way is through trauma that creates emotional programming that outlives its original context. A third way is through the development of shame-based identity that becomes disconnected from any specific behavior. The possibility of realignment. The good news is that emotional programming, even when significantly disconnected from current reality, can be realigned with that reality. The realignment happens through repeated experience of being competent that creates enough evidence that the emotional system begins to update. This requires accumulation of evidence. One success does not typically shift years of programming. But multiple successes gradually update the emotional system. The amygdala begins to learn that you are not actually inadequate. Chapter 9. Trauma, Wounding, and the Deep Programming of Fear. Trauma is the deepest and most intractable form of emotional programming. Traumatic experiences do not simply create emotional patterns that can be discussed. They leave marks on the nervous system itself. What trauma does to the nervous system? Trauma is not primarily a memory or a story. It is a physiological disruption of the nervous system. A traumatic event is one that overwhelms the person's ability to cope. After trauma, the nervous system can become stuck in a state of hypervigilance. The threat detection systems remain on high alert. The amygdala becomes hypersensitive. The person is in a chronic state of low-level threat response. The nervous system that has been traumatized learns that the world is dangerous. This learning is not a belief. It is a bodily, physiological learning that operates outside of conscious awareness. Trauma memories and the frozen past. One of the distinctive features of traumatic programming is the way traumatic memories are encoded. Normal memories are processed and integrated. Traumatic memories are often fragmented and unintegrated. They feel like they are happening in the present, not in the past. This is why trauma survivors often respond to reminders as if the trauma is happening right now. The nervous system has not updated its assessment of threat. Complex trauma and relational wounding. Beyond single-incident traumatic events, there is complex trauma, repeated experiences of harm within relationships that are supposed to be safe. Childhood abuse, ongoing domestic violence, repeated betrayals create deep programming. When the person who is supposed to protect you is the source of harm, the nervous system faces an impossible situation. The nervous system has to adapt by splitting, maintaining attachment while also protecting itself. The permanence and impermanence of traumatic programming. While traumatic programming is deep and persistent, it is not permanent. The nervous system can be healed. But this healing does not happen automatically with time. The healing requires specific kinds of intervention and support. There is a dignity in understanding that you are not broken for still being affected by trauma. Your nervous system is doing what it was designed to do. Chapter 10. Why suppression and resistance fail. Having understood how emotions are programmed, we come to a critical question. If my emotions are programming, why can I not simply stop them? Why can I not just decide not to feel anxious? The answer is the subject of this chapter, because suppression and resistance of emotions do not work. In fact, they typically make the emotional programming stronger. The futility of direct suppression. The most straightforward approach to dealing with unwanted emotions is to try to suppress them, to not feel them, to push them away. Everyone has tried this. Most people have found that it does not work. Why does it not work? Because emotions are not voluntary. You cannot simply decide to not feel anxious. Emotions are generated by neural systems that operate largely outside of conscious control. This is not a failure of willpower or effort. It is a fundamental truth about how emotions work. They are not under voluntary control. The rebound effect. Beyond simply not working, suppression often backfires. When you try to suppress a thought or feeling, you must monitor for instances of the unwanted thought in order to suppress them. This monitoring keeps the unwanted material more cognitively active. Research has repeatedly demonstrated this rebound effect. People instructed to not think about something end up thinking about it more than people not given that instruction. Why acceptance works where suppression fails. If suppression does not work and resistance does not work, what does work? The answer is acceptance. Accepting the emotion, allowing it to be there, not fighting it. Why does acceptance work? Because acceptance removes the secondary layer of suffering that fighting the emotion creates. When you accept an emotion without fighting it, it is allowed to complete its cycle. Emotions, when not interrupted, tend to move through and transform. This does not mean you do nothing about emotions. It means you change what you do. Instead of suppressing, you acknowledge. Instead of fighting, you allow. Instead of making it go away, you observe it. Chapter 11. The practice of witnessing, observing your programming. If suppression and resistance do not work, what does? The foundation of all effective work with emotional programming is the practice of witnessing, the development of the capacity to observe your emotions without judgment, without trying to change them, and without identifying with them. What witnessing is and is not. Witnessing is not suppression. You are not trying to not feel. Witnessing is not analysis. You are not trying to understand the emotion's roots. Witnessing is a simple, direct observation, noticing that the emotion is present, observing what it feels like. Witnessing is most similar to what people in meditation traditions call mindfulness, a quality of open, non-judgmental awareness. The power of the gap between observer and observed. One of the most profound effects of developing the capacity to witness is the creation of a gap between the part of you experiencing the emotion and the part observing it. This gap is where freedom begins. As long as you are identified with your emotions, as long as you say, "I am angry," rather than, "I am observing anger," your emotions run you. But the moment you can observe anger without being anger, something shifts. You are no longer identified with it. From the position of the witness, you have choice. You can feel angry and choose how to respond. You can feel afraid and choose whether to act on the fear. The emotion is still there, but it is not controlling you. The specific practice of witnessing. How do you develop this capacity for witnessing? Through practice. Simple, direct, repeated practice. When you notice an emotion arising, pause. Instead of immediately acting or suppressing, simply observe. Where do you feel it in your body? Notice the physical sensations. What is the quality of the feeling? What thoughts are arising? What impulses are being generated? This simple practice of observation, without judgment, without trying to change anything, is the foundation of all the work that follows. The practice in daily life. Formal meditation is one place where witnessing can be developed. But witnessing should be practiced in daily life, in the midst of actual emotions. When you are in a situation that triggers an emotional response, you pause and witness. You are in a meeting and feel anxious. Instead of pushing through or letting it overwhelm you, you pause and observe. Anxiety is here. What does it feel like? This creates a gap, a moment of choice, where you can respond to the situation rather than being automatically run by your emotion. Chapter 12. Reprogramming, how change actually happens. Having understood emotions as programming and developed the capacity to witness them, the question becomes, how do you actually change the programming? The impossibility of change through willpower alone. You cannot change emotional programming through sheer willpower. You cannot simply decide that you are no longer anxious. This is actually liberating, because it means you do not have to blame yourself for not being able to change through willpower alone. The emotional programming you have is not a moral failing. It is neural circuitry that was shaped by your history. And neural circuitry changes through experience, not through deciding. The three primary mechanisms of neural change. So how does the nervous system change? The research suggests three primary mechanisms. The first mechanism is extinction learning, the repeated experience of encountering a stimulus that was previously feared without the feared consequence. A person feared public speaking. They practice speaking repeatedly, many times. The fear conditioning gradually extinguishes. The second mechanism is new learning, the formation of new neural circuits through repeated practice and experience. A person practices in a domain repeatedly, successfully. Neural circuits for competence in that domain are built. The third mechanism is reconsolidation, the updating of existing memories through new information or new context. A person encounters a reminder of a trauma in a safe way. The memory is reactivated, and in the safe context, it is updated. All three of these mechanisms operate through experience. The nervous system learns through doing. The role of context and safety in reprogramming. One crucial factor that determines whether emotional reprogramming happens is the presence of safety. The nervous system needs to feel safe in order to update its threat assessment. In your own work with emotional programming, the environment and context matter. It is harder to reprogram anxiety in an environment that is chaotic. It is easier in an environment that feels safe and supported. The role of attention in reprogramming. Another crucial factor is attention and awareness. Neural circuits that are attended to and practiced are strengthened. Neural circuits that are not attended to gradually weaken. If you want to change your emotional programming, you need to repeatedly activate the new neural patterns you want while reducing the activation of the old patterns. This means practicing the new response in actual situations. Bringing it together. The multi-level approach to reprogramming. Effective reprogramming typically involves working on multiple levels simultaneously. At the behavioral level, practicing new behaviors, exposing yourself to feared situations. At the cognitive level, examining and revising narratives. At the physiological level, exercise, sleep, nutrition, breathwork. At the relational level, connecting with safe relationships. At the contemplative level, meditation. No single approach works for everyone. What is required is an integrated approach. Chapter 13. Creating new emotional baselines. Beyond addressing specific emotional patterns, there is the larger work of shifting your baseline, the typical or default emotional state that your nervous system returns to. Understanding emotional baselines. Your emotional baseline is somewhat like your body's thermostat. Your nervous system maintains a relatively consistent baseline level of activation and a characteristic emotional tone. Some people's baselines are characterized by high activation and anxiety. Some are characterized by low activation and depression. Your baseline is shaped by your temperament, your nervous system's conditioning history, your current life circumstances, and your habitual practices. It is not fixed, but it is relatively stable. The role of physiological state in baseline shifts. One of the most direct and efficient ways to shift your emotional baseline is through physiological interventions. The state of your body has a direct effect on your emotional baseline. Someone in chronic sleep deprivation will have a baseline more characterized by irritability. Someone who is physically deconditioned will have a baseline more characterized by low energy and depression. Conversely, consistent exercise, adequate sleep, good nutrition all support a baseline of relative calm and resilience. The role of relational connection in baseline shifts. Another powerful shifter of emotional baseline is relational connection. The nervous system is profoundly social. We regulate our emotional states partly through connection with others. When we are in a relationship with someone who is calm, regulated, and safe, our nervous system tends to calm as well. Isolation, difficult relationships, and lack of safe connection support a baseline of anxiety and deficiency. The role of practices and habits in baseline shifts. Finally, your emotional baseline is shaped by the practices and habits you engage in repeatedly. If you meditate daily, your baseline gradually becomes more calm. If you practice gratitude, your baseline gradually becomes more positive. What all have in common is that they are not heroic effort. It is modest, consistent practice sustained over time that gradually reprograms the nervous system. Chapter 14. Freedom from emotional identity. Living as conscious choice. We arrive now at the ultimate destination of this journey, genuine freedom from emotional identification. What freedom actually means. Freedom from emotional identification does not mean having no emotions. It means having access to the full range of your emotional life without being controlled by it. It means being able to feel anger without being run by anger. What freedom actually means is the development of mature emotional agency, the capacity to have emotions and, at the same time, to choose how to respond. You feel anxious and you act anyway. You feel afraid and you move toward what matters. The difference between reacting and responding. One of the most practical ways to understand emotional freedom is the distinction between reacting and responding. When you are identified with an emotion and run by it, you react. The emotion arises and you automatically do what it is designed to make you do. When you have developed freedom from emotional identification, you respond. You notice the emotion and choose. You might choose to act on the action tendency, or you might choose to override it because something else is more important. The role of values in creating freedom. One of the most powerful supports for maintaining emotional freedom is clarity about your values, what actually matters to you. When you are clear about your values, You have something larger than the emotion to orient toward. Someone who values honesty but is afraid of conflict can feel the fear and still speak the truth because honesty is what matters. The emotion is still there, but it is not the final arbiter of behavior. Living with emotional fluidity. Another aspect of emotional freedom is the capacity for emotional fluidity, to move through the full range of emotions without being stuck. Most people without freedom from emotional identification are somewhat stuck. Emotional freedom allows for emotional fluidity. You can feel anxiety and then move into calm. You can feel sadness and then move into joy. The emotions are allowed to move and change. The responsibility that comes with freedom. Freedom from emotional identification comes with responsibility. When you are emotionally identified, when the emotion is running you, there is a kind of excuse, I did not have a choice. But as you develop freedom, this excuse is no longer available. You have choice, and because you have choice, you are responsible for the choices you make. A life of authentic freedom. The end point of this journey is not the achievement of some perfect, permanent state of emotional freedom. It is the development of the capacity to live authentically, to feel what you genuinely feel, to acknowledge it, to work with it, and to choose your responses in alignment with what matters to you.